I love to be a student of the culture. I love watching the culture. I don't know about you, but I kind of watch the news. I watch social media, asking that question, what's got people's attention? What are they talking about? What's the buzz out there? What is that thing that people either have an uproar about or they're just getting excited about? Those are the things that I really try to pay attention to because you know what? There's always more than just what you see. There's kind of always a conversation underneath the conversation going on, really something else fueling this thing, making it go viral. And you have to kind of, as a student of the culture, try to get to the bottom. What's really driving this thing? Well, about a month ago, Pastor Ben turned me on to something that was starting to make some noise out there, and it was gaining some steam, and it was really interesting conversation. It was an Instagram post by a guy, and it was called Preachers and Sneakers. I don't know if you've seen that, but man, this thing really caught several people's attentions, and it was really started innocently. It wasn't meant to be a bad thing. This guy really just likes shoes, and this wasn't his first time posting. He would post famous people, whether that's singers or actors or politicians, whatever. He would show the shoes they're wearing and just kind of say, here's how much it costs and here's where you can probably get a pair of these if you want to. But one day on Instagram, he posted Preachers and Sneakers. He decided to look at some of the more influential pastors out there, you know, what we might call the celebrity pastors, the one that a lot of people know. And he began to show the shoes they were wearing and what they cost. But what he didn't count on was how quickly it went viral and how angry and mad and how much buzz there was to this thing. People, it really caught their attention. And we have to ask, well, what was it that caught their attention? It was the price of the shoes. The price of the shoes caught their attention. There was one pastor, he had a pair of shoes that are somewhere between $5,000 to $6,000, for instance, called Air Yeezy Red October. I have never heard of Air Yeezy schools or shoes, but there's a reason I can't afford them. Good gracious, you know, $5,600 for a pair of shoes. There was another one that had a $3,000 pair of basketball shoes. One of them had like an $1,100, $1,200 pair of leather boots, and another one he had Gucci loafers that were about $820, and it went on from there. But it didn't stop there either, because another group of people began to now focus on the clothes they were wearing. And they started to look at what the clothes were, and suddenly you started seeing posts on Instagram like, that dude's wearing $800 gym pants. I didn't know there were $800 gym pants out there. He's wearing these $800 gym pants. Another one's like, he had a $750 pair of jeans, or that's a $400 belt that he's got on there, or that dude's carrying a $2,000 Gucci backpack. And more people were just talking and talking and talking. This thing grew legs and just kind of went on its own. And the reality is there was people on both sides of this conversation. There was one group that's saying, great job, Pastor, you look great, keep up the good work, awesome job. But there was a second group that was getting upset by what they were seeing, and their responses looked a lot different. They were asking questions like, how much do pastors make? You know what I mean? And asking questions like, is this where the tithes and the offerings are going? So it was causing quite a buzz. And I'm going to hit time out for just a second because I know someone out there is going, all right, Pastor, fess up. How much for the shoes? All right? I get it. They're $35. I got them online, all right? I'm wearing a $29.99 pair of jeans that were on sale at Kohl's, and I am wearing a $24 shirt that I bought for myself for Easter. On Easter, I wore the $18 shirt my wife picked after seeing the shirt that I had picked for Easter. That's as fancy as I get on this. But this really caused an uproar, and I want to be clear here. I'm not taking sides either way on it. We started this conversation, I just want to say, I'm a student of culture. What's those things that cause a stir, that cause a buzz? What's going viral out there, and why? Because one of the things we have to learn, and there were some great leadership takeaways from this conversation as it continues, and one of them is leaders need to pay attention to what's going on out there in the culture. They just need to be aware of what's going on out there. But there's really two big takeaways that leaders have to pay attention to, and we're going to talk more and more about those today. The first big takeaway is all leaders have to remember, in this thing I'm about to do, or this thing I'm about to say, what am I communicating? See, just because you think you're saying something doesn't mean that's what others hear. Have you learned that before? You think you're saying something, but that doesn't mean that's what they just heard. And leaders have to live in that tension of understanding, listen, in this next thing I'm about to do, what am I about to communicate here? And is that valuable? Do I want to communicate that thing? That's one of the big takeaways from that conversation. The second big takeaway is something that several mentors have told me along the way, and it's an old English saying, so we've probably heard it before, but it's a great, great reminder. And what's that old saying? That old saying is this: just because you can doesn't mean you. Let's hear that again. Just because you can doesn't mean you. Right. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. Again, getting back to asking that question, what am I about to communicate? This thing that I do, how is it going to be received? How will people see it? I think that's important, and leaders have to keep that in mind if they're going to be effective leaders in the culture around them. Today we're going to continue in our Nehemiah series, and we've been learning some great leadership stuff from Nehemiah. Just a powerful, effective leader. I've just gotten so much from it. I hope you have as well. But today we're going to learn that Nehemiah, there was a buzz, there was a stir. There were some conversations going on where people were crying out, and he too was going to have to pay attention to that. He was going to have to step into that and do something about it. But even more than that, what we're going to see from Nehemiah today, it was also going to cause him to have to look inside, to see inside himself and ask, how is my behavior either contributing to this thing, or how do I need to change in order to make this thing better or to correct it? And so once again, we're going to learn a lot from Nehemiah. And so what I want to encourage you today is we're going to be hanging out in Nehemiah chapter 5. So if you have your Bibles, turn to Nehemiah 5 if you have your electronic device. But we also put the verses up on the screen, so follow along in whatever way you're comfortable. I'm just so glad that you're here and looking forward to hearing what the Lord has to say today. So let's open up Nehemiah 5 and let's see what it has to say as we have a little bit of reading to do to get caught up and figure this story out. Nehemiah 5:1, it says, "Now the men and their wives raised a great outcry against their fellow Jews. Some were saying, 'We and our sons and daughters are numerous, and in order for us to eat and stay alive, we must get grain.' Others were saying, 'Well, we're mortgaging our fields and our vineyards and our homes to get grain during the famine.' Still others were saying, 'We've had to borrow money, pay the king's tax on our field and vineyards.' And although we are all of the same flesh and blood, we're all Jews, and our other fellow Jews, and though our children are as good as theirs, we have had to subject our sons and daughters to slavery. Some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but we are powerless because our fields and our vineyards belong to others." So what's going on in this story? It's important to note this is right in the middle of Nehemiah building the wall. The wall is under construction at this time, and some point during the building of the wall, there's an outcry. The people cry out and they want to be heard. And it mentions in this verse a famine. It's the first time we've heard about this famine, and I think that's important that it mentions it there. And apparently this was a rather severe famine. People really weren't able to grow enough food to support themselves, and so this group of people who were probably the poor, the peasants, were having to go to the wealthy landowners and to the people of influence and beg for food or to borrow money for food. That's where we pick up the story, and they're crying out as a result of that. And I think there's some takeaways, some things we can kind of deduce from the story as to how severe this famine was, some things we know right away. As I mentioned, the wall is under construction. And so while the wall is under construction, all the men that would normally be out in the field making it happen, getting the food, are in Jerusalem building the wall. That's only making the famine worse. We've also learned from the past weeks that Nehemiah's had to push at the other city-state leaders, some people that were taking advantage of the Jews in Jerusalem and so forth, and he's pushing pushing back at them, which has broken down the normal trade channels, and that's only made the situation worse as well. And so there's a lot of things that have accumulated, and what we have is a really severe famine. People are hungry. They're not able to grow the food. They then have gone to a group of influential, wealthy people, and they're asking to borrow money by either mortgaging or their homes and land or a second mortgage. They've even had to sell their land in some cases, and another group of them have had to put their children, particularly their daughters, in slavery in order to make money for them to buy food. That's the situation we're in as this story opens up in Nehemiah. And as a result, the people are crying out. They're saying, this is unfair. This isn't right. What are you going to do about it? It's here now we pick up on Nehemiah stepping into his leadership role. It's here we see how he responds to these cries of the hungry people who are being taken advantage of in this situation. And it's really amazing how much we can learn just from a couple verses in Scripture. Just by looking at 2 verses, how much we can learn about not only how Nehemiah responds, but what is some great leadership at a time like this. We see those couple verses in Nehemiah chapter 5, verse 6 and 7. Those verses says this: when I heard their outcry and these charges, I was very angry. I pondered them in my mind and then accused the nobles and officials. We're going to reference back this verse several times because there's so many golden nuggets sitting in here about how Nehemiah's leadership stepped into this moment. But what's the first big thing we see about Nehemiah? What do we have to learn from this story and how he reacts, how he engages this situation? And I think this is an important one for all leaders because this is one that a lot of leaders struggle with. I even have to work on this one as well. But the most effective leaders I know do this well. What is that? Effective leaders listen. Nehemiah listened. It said in that verse, I heard their outcry. They hear the cries. They listen. Even if it's not the news they want to hear, leaders are willing to hear the good news. They're willing to get the bad news as well. Great, effective leaders take the time to listening. And listening requires that you stop sometimes and you take the time to hear what people have to say. Because there's a trap here. The story doesn't say it, but again, you can see this trap from what's going on in the story as we've learned it up to this point. There's a trap a lot of leaders can fall in that we have to be careful of. You say, well, what's that trap? That trap's what I call tunnel vision. You ever heard that? Most of us have. What's tunnel vision? Tunnel vision is you get so focused on the thing at hand, that thing you're doing, that you fail to hear from the people around you. You fail to see the other things going on. You get so focused on this thing that you have to do, and I'm going to do it no matter what, that you can fail to see what's going on around you. Has that ever happened to you, or have you ever known somebody where that happens? It's a trap leaders could fall in, and you could see that Nehemiah could have fallen into that trap here. He was busy building a wall. He was negotiating with the city-states around him. He was talking to the suppliers. He was talking to the labor. He was probably designing and helped design the wall, getting stuff where it needs. All the things leaders have to do to accomplish a thing at hand. Building the walls, building the gates, that's a big deal. And if we're not careful as leaders, we can get so focused on this one thing, we don't hear the cries of the hurting and the poor and the lost and the hungry. We have to be very careful. Nehemiah showed great leadership because he took the time to listen. And as leaders, we need to do that as well too. Be sure to listen, hear what they have to say. But then we ask, what was Nehemiah's response? As he listened and as he heard what they had to say, what was his response? And it was interesting what that verse said. It says he got angry. That verse says he got angry, which leads to a question. Again, another one of those things we have to wrestle with a little bit. Is it okay for a leader to get angry? I mean, is that okay? Because I think sometimes in our culture, we teach that if a leader gets angry, if a leader gets mad, that's a sign of weakness. That's poor leadership. That's failure on their part. But are leaders allowed to get mad? I mean, leaders, they just have ice running in their veins, right? Nothing phases them, man. Yet we see Nehemiah getting angry. And I will tell you, I think some of the best leaders out there get angry sometimes. In fact, I think we're supposed to. Because when we see injustice, when we see things that are evil, that are unholy, and that are just wrong, there should be something inside of us that stirs up and says, this will not stand. This cannot go on. Somebody has to stand up to this and make a difference. I think that's a big part of any leadership. And so there are times when you're going to get mad. There are times you're going to get angry. In fact, we see Paul saying in Ephesians chapter 4, this amazing verse. He says, in your anger, do not sin. Notice Paul doesn't say, don't get angry. He doesn't say anger is wrong or anger is bad. Paul recognizes there's going to be times you get angry. What he says, though, and what the Bible seems to be more concerned with time and time again, isn't so much whether or not you get angry. What the Bible seems to be concerned with is what is your posture in that anger? How will you act in that anger? Because there's a godly anger and there's an ungodly reaction to anger, and many of us have seen that before, right? Those are called temper tantrums and fits. And many of us have done things in anger I think probably we would regret, right? Or am I the only one? Yeah, I think a lot of us have done things in anger we regret. And the Bible understands there's going to be things that will make you angry, and that's healthy. There are things in this world when we see them that are so inherently evil, we should be angry when we see it. But in your anger, do not sin. And there's all kinds of things that are anger, small things, big things. I mean, small things like, when you come home and the garage door is open and nobody's home. And the doors are unlocked, and the house is lit up like Vegas, apparently. And the oven's still on. You forgot to turn the oven off. And you say, well, that's not a big deal. Well, yeah, it is, because I've told him 2 or 3 times, right, son? You know what I mean? But there's bigger stuff, too, isn't there? There's things like slavery, sex trafficking, hunger, oppression. Those sort of things should catch our eyes. And great leaders, really good leaders, get mad about the right things. In fact, what makes them mad are the things that makes God mad. And yes, the Bible does talk that there are things that make God mad. Many of the things I just listed, God seemed very concerned about how we treated the poor, the widows, the orphans, those who were in prison. There were times even in the Bible when God would say, away with your sacrifices. Don't you know what I want? I want justice. In other words, I don't want your fake worship. Live out a life of worship. See, when we get angry about the things that make God angry, then our heart is beating as God's heart beats. And when we see injustice and unrighteousness, it should not only break our heart, but stir us in anger into action. But now we have to ask, then how did Nehemiah in his anger step into this? What was his next thing? And we saw in that verse, it said he pondered these things. What does that mean? Well, it means he took a step back. He thought about it. He got perspective. He decided to look at it from a different angle, put a different set of lenses on. He waited a moment. And here's where we see another great leadership trait from some of the best leaders I've seen out there, and something we have to keep in mind as we lead others too. What's that great trait? It's this: great leaders learn to stop and think. Stop and think. Take a step back, hit the pause button. This is why your mom growing up would tell you count to 10 before you say this next thing. This is why I tell the staff, family, people around me, hey, before you hit send on that email or send on that text message, take a step back for a minute, take an hour, take 2, come back. It'll still be there when you come back. And after a couple hours, if you're feeling the same, hit send. But if you think, hey, maybe I need to rewrite this thing or just not send it at all, you will have saved yourself a great deal of grief of having to go back, apologize, fix, whatever it may be. Or am I the only person who has sent an email out before and said, oops? Got quiet suddenly, didn't it? Probably all of us in anger have maybe sent something or said something we wished we had not. Nehemiah, in his leadership, pondered. He took a step back, he hit the pause button, and decided to think about it a little bit. And I get it. The people are crying. They're in a hurry. We need this thing. But he still decided, no, we're going to take a step back, regather ourselves, think it through. Because great leaders want to do the right thing. And that's a great thing we learn from him. But what did he do next, it says? Well, after thinking about it and pondering it, it says he accused the nobles and the leaders. Strong language. But he accused them. And what's clear and what he's doing, and another one of those great things leaders do, bold leaders confront issues. They do. They don't pretend it's not there. They don't ignore it or hope it goes away. Bold leaders understand you have to step into this thing and address it. You have to confront it. You got to do something about it. You don't just sweep it under the rug, put it under a rock, and maybe you won't have to deal with it. They don't do that. Bold leaders confront it. But with that, we see a second piece that all the great leaders I know do, and a posture they take when confronting something. And this is really one of the big ones that separates good leaders from great leaders. What is it we see? Well, yes, while they confront issues, they also see problems as opportunity. They don't necessarily see that problem and go, woe is me, the world has come to an end, this is the most terrible thing. No, great leaders, they're going to confront this thing, but they also, the best of the best out there, they see problems as opportunities. In other words, we now have the chance in this thing to be better. We can raise the bar, we can improve. This is an opportunity. I maybe didn't even see this opportunity. I maybe didn't even know it was there. But now we have the privilege to step into this thing and be better. But do you see problems as opportunities in your lives? Do you address them that? Do you attack them that way? Great leaders like Nehemiah, see this as a chance to say, no, we can advance the ball down the field. We're going to wrestle through this. We're going to confront it. We're going to work through it. It may be hard, but we have the opportunity here to be better. And it's just great watching Nehemiah do that. But we have to realize, though, if we're going to confront people, and if we're going to engage these things, there's a wrong and a right way to do it. Jesus taught us the right way to talk to people. He knew there was going to be times, particularly in the church, but in our families, when we were going to have to engage something, when we were going to have to confront somebody or something. And so in Matthew 18, he leaves us this great set of instructions on how to engage that conversation. I think this is important. Some of you know this, but it's a great review. If you've got to confront somebody or you're struggling with something, you know you have to deal with something, this is a great reminder. What did Jesus say? He says, if your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault. Now, I want to say this next part all together, so I'm going to read that first line again. If your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault. Say this with me, just between the two of you, right? If they sin, point out their fault just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you have won them over. But he continued on. But if you will not listen, or if they will not listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. But if they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church. In other words, as a church body, come find a church leader, whether it's a board member, one of the pastors, privately talk to them about it, but only after you've gone through those other steps at that point. And if they refuse to listen even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. A lot of people read that last line to mean kick them out of the church, and that's not what it means. One of the core values we have at Radiant Church, for instance, is come as you are. And I would ask this question, can a pagan or a tax collector come to Radiant Church? You bet you they can. Everybody is welcome at Radiant. It's come as you are. It means even the people you don't like get to come. What it's saying, though, is there's a difference between someone who just attends and what we call partners. Partners is that membership leadership step we have in there. Not everybody who attends is a partner. We hold our leaders to a high standard here at the church. But I'd always say, listen, everyone's invited. Even if you don't agree with me, even if I don't agree with you, everyone's invited. Come as you are. But when we confront folks, we need to keep this in mind. I had someone come to me just a bit ago. She's like, Pastor, did you see what that person put on Facebook? And I'm like, yeah, it looked like they were having a pretty bad day. And they said, well, what are you going to do about it? And my first reaction was like, good grief, what am I, the Facebook police? You know, what am I going to do about it? Why do I have to do something about it? So imagine my surprise as we sat down and began to read Matthew 18 together, and I asked, now what does Matthew 18 say we're supposed to do? And she says, I'm supposed to go talk to them, aren't I? Yes, you are. But privately. Don't post it on their wall for everyone to see. Don't even messenger. Talk to them. Pick the phone up, go to their house, whatever, and talk to them as Jesus would talk. Lovingly, mercifully, gracefully, with kindness. Be strong, but be loving in that. We're going to see one last trait from Nehemiah. A big one that could actually be easy to read right past in this chapter. So interesting, a piece I had no idea about in the story. We pick that up in verse 10, so interesting. He said, that's Nehemiah, I and my brothers and my men, in other words, my entourage, I'm also lending money to people and grain. But notice what he puts on the end here. But let us stop charging interest. Nehemiah was doing it too. The very thing that people were crying out about, he was doing it too. And it's really easy to say, oh, this must mean that the Bible's against interest. This must mean interest is bad. But you totally missed the point of the story if you landed there. It's not what it's about. The word in the Old English on this is usury, actually, and the word usury means exorbitant interest. In other words, we're talking credit card interest here, or buy here, pay here lot stuff. You know what I mean? Like they're charging exorbitant interest on their friends. But it's worse than that. It's not like they were coming in trying to buy a house or a car. These people were hungry. They needed to eat. What did they do? They took advantage of them in their time of need, and they charged them interest, an exorbitant amount of interest. These wealthy, influential people were using their power in a way to oppress another group of people. That's what's wrong in this story. It's not a story about interest, it's a story about greed. Money's not bad. We need more wealthy people who are advancing the kingdom of Jesus Christ on earth so that people are introduced to Jesus, whatever it takes and wherever God sends us. We need that. That's great. That can be awesome. With money comes stewardship, though. We do not allow it to make us greedy. These folks had allowed their money to make them greedy. And Nehemiah, when he looked inside and he saw the situation and he heard the cries, realized, oh man, I'm doing the same thing. But he did something that great leaders do, something that we need to keep in mind. And what is that? He openly admitted his mistakes. He openly admitted his mistakes. He led by example. He's going to walk the walk. I wonder in our culture, in our families, in our businesses, how much better we would be if leaders admitted when they were wrong. Rather than trying to deflect or defend or blame it on somebody else, how much more could we accomplish if leaders did this? And I get it. This is considered in our culture another leadership weakness. Good leaders don't admit when they're wrong, right? No. We see Nehemiah here saying, no, I was wrong. And if we're going to change, it's going to start with me. I'm going to do the right thing and admit I'm wrong and change. That's what good leaders do. And I wonder how much better our homes would be, how much better our corporations would be. And heaven forbid I use the word politics in this room. How much better our politicians and our politics would be if leaders were willing to admit when they were wrong and make the changes that are necessary in humility to obey God. Which leads to a big last question here. Is there something in your life you need to admit you're wrong about? Stop doing it and make a course correction. Because what we find out with Nehemiah here is so true about sin. We often think, the bad part of sin is what it does to me. And that's absolutely true. Sin is destructive. It is harmful. Sin hurts us. But what I've noticed about sin, and I don't know if you've noticed this too, is rarely does it just affect you. Sin almost always affects the people around you. Sin is not just destructive to you, it's destructive to everyone around you. When I lie to you, I'm destroying you. When I steal from you, I'm destroying you. That's the problem with sin. And we have to be able to say, I'm wrong. I admit it. We can't allow this to go on. We've got to change. You almost hear Jesus in the story in Matthew 5 when you listen and say, listen, brother, remove the plank out of your own eye before you try to remove the speck out of another brother's eye. In other words, clean up your own house before you try to go clean someone else's. Is there something in your life that needs to change? Which gets us to our so what moment real quickly. I love this quote from a guy named Peter Drucker. Don't believe he's a Christian, but great author in the business world. So important though. He says, management is doing things right, but leadership is doing the right things. Great leaders know how to do the right things. It's not just about doing your job well. Great leaders identify the right things and they do them. And in this story, Nehemiah chose to do the right things. He chose to put his obedience to God above his wants, needs, and desires, even money in this case. And let's be clear, a group of wealthy, influential people were taking advantage of some hungry people who just needed to eat. They were misusing the situation. They were oppressing and enslaving these people. And all too often, I'm sorry, but all too often in this world we live in the world system we live in, it tends to favor those who have wealth, power, and influence. And the problem is this, again, money isn't the problem, greed is. The problem is, in our wealth, we can become comfortable. And when we become comfortable, we can become deaf. We can fail to hear the cries of the poor, the oppressed, the hungry, the lost around us. And this is my last takeaway. If you take nothing away, just take this, please. This is the culmination that all too often we separate our money from our walk from God. You hear me on that? It's not a tithing thing here, although that falls into this category. But this is about using what God gives you in a godly way. All too often, we separate our wealth from our walk from God. God has my obedience in all these areas, but not this one, Lord. You don't get this one, not my money. And there's a warning to this story, and that warning is this. Whenever you fail to bless others as you have been blessed, you will find yourself a stranger to the purposes of God. When you fail to bless others as you have been blessed, you'll find yourself a stranger to the blessings of God. And you say, what do you mean by that? Simply this. What does it mean? What does it mean to understand the purposes of God? And the purposes of God is this. You are called to be a light on the hill. You are called to shine your light in the darkness. It's the very name, to be a radiant light. That's the name of our church. Where it says overcoming darkness, we exist for that. We believe that we exist to shine the light of Christ into the dark places of this world so that others may see. And that we exist as a people to care for the hungry, the poor, the weak, and the oppressed. That's why we are here. And we do not enslave our friends. We do not enslave the people around us. We are the people who have been called to set others free because Jesus Christ set us free. And when we set them free and when we shine that light, They see that Jesus living in and through us, and they know there's hope and healing in this world. They see it in you. We do not oppress. Let's pray.